not only are you in this innovative founder mode, you're in the realm of transcendence because you've transcended any established order, and therefore you're close to gods, spirits, muses, angels, and the whole realm of the mystical / religious / spiritual. When I was in El Salvador, I was invited there to give a talk on education, talked about Plato's laws. Curtis Yarvin was there giving a speech as well. When I was there were many people saying they're moving back. It's like, our families moved away when it got to be too violent and when it looked like the country was completely falling apart. Now that it's getting better, people are moving back. Heidegger, in presenting his thoughts, which can be, as I said, structurally mystical, he's fully within the realm of the language of philosophy. So he's writing about truth, he's writing about being. It becomes mystical without ceasing to be philosophical.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Michael Millerman, philosopher and founder of the Millerman School. We discussed Leo Strauss, the ancients and the moderns, what role technologists have in influencing and learning from philosophy, and the crisis of modernity. If you like the show, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. Hopefully, you're not just helping us, but you're helping someone you know find something informative and entertaining. And this isn't sponsored, but if you're interested in the topics or the philosophers that Michael speaks about, then a great way to learn more would be to check out his platform, Millerman School. Without further ado, here's Michael Millerman. How would Strauss characterize the ancients and the moderns?
Well, I would say that the most common and kind of easiest entry point into the distinction in Strauss's writing is that the ancients took their orientation, their standard for the best regime and the best way of life. They oriented around the question of human excellence. So they were primarily interested in the rare cases of human perfection, in the most exceptional cases of complete human virtue, in a kind of vertical orientation towards the peaks of human existence, understood as the highest perfections of the soul. And you could say that there are two peaks or two mountains, two pole stars, moral perfection and intellectual perfection. And, that's represented in the various accounts of the virtues that you find in Plato and Aristotle. And for Strauss, the moderns break with that classic orientation towards what's best in us and best about us by, and he used different kind of versions of characterizing this change, but by lowering the bar from the rare cases of human perfection to the more common and low human denominators, like, for example, fear of violent death, desire for personal glory, those kinds of things, comfortable self-preservation. Those are formulas that he uses for Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke, the people who were responsible for the first wave of modernity in Strauss's account. So the easiest way to see the distinction, to repeat, is the ancients took their bearings by man's virtue, understood in its great, high, exalted sense, at least as a lens through which to understand the possibilities of human and political life. They weren't naive about how people actually are. They didn't believe that we're angels. They didn't think that you could expect or control human life and society in a way to always get the outcome that you wanted. So that's another part of Strauss's characterization of the difference between the classics and the moderns, is that the classics understood that there's an element of chance in the best political regime, the chance coincidence of wisdom and power, whereas the moderns tried to make these things more calculable, more easily, how could you put it, constructed. So they tried to conquer chance in the service of a more predictable political science that was based on what is low and common, rather than on the chance occurrence of this coincidence of wisdom and power. So those are, there are other differences, but as I say, the easiest first approximation is along those lines.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. How does the idea of quantity and quantification play into all of this?
Well, there are authors, outside of Strauss's world, but who share somehow his criticisms of modernity, who make the turn towards quantity somehow the pillar of their criticism. For example, Rene Guénon in The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times has
Right.
his own sort of traditionalist response to the rise of modern mathematical science and mathematical physics. And I mean, I guess in some sense, Strauss does have really beautifully formulated sentences on the two temptations, you could say, the two directions that we have in human life, which is a temptation or a direction towards the homogeneous, towards whatever can be captured, you could say, through quantity, through number, through calculation. And that has a certain sort of appeal to it because there you have a certain kind of precision, mathematical precision. You have proofs that can be constructed that are very rigorous, and you have methods that can be applied broadly, if not universally. So the whole realm of computation, calculation, quantification, obviously, it's a part of human life, and it has great appeal, especially when it can be applied, and you can see the results coming from it. But the other part of the human soul, Strauss said, or the other sort of temptation or direction that we can be charmed by, is the heterogeneous ends of human life. So again, he saw mathematics as the realm of homogeneity, and you could say psychology as the realm of heterogeneity, meaning here that there are different ends for the human soul, different ends that we might pursue. The whole mystery of human life somehow is not captured by the problem of quantity. It's qualitative and somehow mysterious and elusive. And I think many of the authors who, each in their own way, are critical of modernity, you could say, or you could map their criticism onto these terms and suggest that they wanted to reorient us towards the mysterious, the elusive, the qualitative. When they do so, it's not always the easy, as I say, the easily accessible qualitative side of life. It can be the deep phenomenology. It can be psychology. It can be the innermost man. It can be moments of mystical ecstasy. It can be all of these sorts of things. Or to repeat for Strauss, as he characterized it, it can be the heterogeneous ends of the human soul. But that's a part of it. So over mathematization of the interpretation of the world, again, common I would say here to Heidegger, to Strauss, to some of the traditionalists like Guénon. And that's a factor. Strauss writes about it most, to my recollection, okay, on the spot. For example, in the Hobbes part of Natural Right and History, where he explains the relationship between our focus on quantity and our focus on power. Somehow power lends itself to analysis of, quanta of power. But when purpose falls out of the equation, it's easier to deal with quantity. Somehow purpose seems like a qualitative consideration.
Even to state a purpose that is different than what is conventionally accepted can be, very controversial. The figure of the technologist, the Elon Musks, the Sam Altmans of the world, because on one hand, I think that they would say to themselves and they would say to the public that they are an aspirational quest. Almost, they're on an aspirational quest. They're trying to do something no one has done before. They're trying to pursue excellence. This pivot towards meritocracy now. However, the actual work that they do is very quantified. It's very much based on metrics and volume. How do
Mm-hmm.
you situate the role of the technologist in either pursuing the excellent or pursuing the universal?
So there are a couple of different approaches, I would say here, a couple of different models that come into play for me personally. So let's take one. There's an author in the Jewish tradition. I teach him in my school. His name is Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. He has a book called The Lonely Man of Faith, which makes a nice case for, by the way, one that you don't often see in anti-modern traditionalist type writers, which is why I think it's deserving of special mention. And Soloveitchik suggests that there are two fundamental human drives, so maybe akin in some sense to what Strauss says when I mentioned the homogeneous and the heterogeneous temptations that we could succumb to. But what Soloveitchik says is that we have two tendencies, each of which, in his view, is divinely sanctioned, and he sees this reflected in the two creation stories in Genesis. One is the world of inner, a redemptive faith, heeding the still small voice, sort of finding God in your life in moments of quiet meditation and contemplation, a sort of depth that takes us inward. And then you have a community of people constituted around that inward faith experience, let's say. And that's sort of obvious out, I would imagine. The one component of divinely sanctioned human religious life is the life of inwardness, prayer, and all of that. But what's surprising for us, I think, is that he says the human tendency to want to explore the cosmos, to take pride in and to celebrate our great technological advancements and discoveries, that all of that too reflects a kind of biblical commandment and a kind of divinely sanctioned impulse to be majestic, as he puts it. And whenever you see the great accomplishments of contemporary technology and science, most recently, I would say the SpaceX feats, that also is remarkable and speaks to this ineradicable and irreducible part of our humanity. So, in some sense, the various tech geniuses and tech titans of the day, they are contributing to deepening that human tendency in us. And I think that it deserves to be seen as truly majestic and magnificent and worthy of the kind of awe that it can inspire. The only difficulty, or the main difficulty, I mean, through this model anyway, is does it come at the expense of because it's easier to see, let's say, that we're going out into space and we're capturing, launching and capturing rockets and doing these unprecedented feats. That's easier to see, easier to celebrate, and somehow it has the potential of drowning out or driving out our subtler concern with the still small voice and everything surrounding that. So part of the challenge is to understand correctly, how do we accept, appreciate, support, and all of that, these great technological discoveries, let's say, developments and accomplishments, without having that technological imperative drive out or destroy the rest of our humanity. Now, one thing I want to say about this briefly about Sam Altman, I don't know that much about him, even about Musk, only what any other layman knows. But I understand that Musk, he takes the position that all of these great feats of technological innovation are meant to be, and he seems pretty adamant about this, in the service of humanity. He's not somebody, and I understand he was once accused here of being a speciesist or speciesist, or somebody who defends humanity and who doesn't just want to see humanity replaced or superseded or overcome or something like that. So that is important. That's an important part of the picture. There is a big question hovering over all of this, which is to what extent the classical models apply, and they don't apply in a one-to-one correspondence, because to accomplish feats of technological engineering and to be able to show successes, we launched this, we caught that, this didn't explode, or that was 5 times faster, 10 times faster, to show all of those results, it doesn't yet mean the same as wisdom or as prudence do in the classical model, because it does show some, pragmatic technical know-how, clearly, obviously. And there may be, wildly divergent ranges of efficiency and competence and genius and vision and all of that between any two particular operators. But again, it doesn't necessarily imply that they're acting with wisdom in a broad sense. It doesn't necessarily imply that that they have deep insight into the nature of, for example, God and the human soul, political life, the things that concerned the classical philosophers in the best case. So even Musk, when he has talked about what sort of political system there should be on Mars, if it ever happens that humanity does colonize Mars, he has said, I think that it should be a direct democracy, because in his view, direct democracy is a good system. But I don't necessarily know that he's thought as deeply about the best political systems as he has thought about, the best propulsion systems, for example. Whereas that would be the most important question for the classical political thinkers.
Right. There is this Um, there's a kind of naivety among tech types, right? I'm not sure if it's performed or explicit or deep naivety, but you see figures like, at least earlier when Elon was starting to get into politics, or, David Sachs, or many other figures in the tech right, express a kind of betrayal, express a kind of shock at how the political system works and the kind of deception that happens within a democracy or, in any kind of government. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they have that kind of naivety, or at least express it?
Well, let's say that some of them do, even though I don't know the whole field of players that well. I would say that some of them, like Thiel, for example, okay, we have to consider Peter Thiel probably one among these figures on the tech right who's both intelligent when it comes to the companies that he's building and the technologies that he's building, and who has some aspirations, let's say, or some designs for involvement in politics, and who also has some background in the relevant text, or who's an intellectual, let's say. People who have read the Straussian moment, they should have a sense of that. People who haven't read it should read it to get a sense of that. So in some cases, you have figures calling, let's say, for transparency. Okay, the most important principle in government should be transparency. Truth and transparency are seen as going hand in hand. Everything should be out in the open. Everything is in principle equally accessible and available. And transparency becomes seen, again, together with truth, as a fundamental value or principle or goal of their systems designs, and systems criticisms. But then, take the case of Thiel, who's closer maybe here to Strauss and closer to Heidegger in some sense, for whom concealment is a necessary part, on one hand, of politics, because after all, you have to have certain secrets of state. For example, you should have certain things that are incompatible with publicity, with publication, with broad distribution, but that are nevertheless necessary for the effective functioning of government. But also, there's a component, this is much more in the realm of Heidegger here, which is that there's some aspect or element of truth itself that conceals itself, that doesn't come to light. There's something about truth that always remains in the dark. And it is a kind of naive aspiration, in my view, or a naive opinion, shared, for instance, by Jordan Peterson, from what I can tell, for whom, again, truth and transparency seem to be like the most important values, and the idea that anything would ever be deliberately suppressed comes to them as obnoxious or distasteful. Whereas that's not the case for either the classical political philosophy of Plato, for whom right from the first few pages, if not paragraphs, of the Republic, there's a tension between justice and truth telling. There's the need for noble lies. There's the view that sometimes it can be right to deceive, to deceive your enemies in order to hurt them, and to deceive your friends in order to help them. So there doesn't seem to be a big space in the model of people like Peterson, for example, as far as I can tell, for things like that. And then, as I say, far from Plato, at the opposite end of the history of philosophy, the relationship of truth and concealment in Heidegger also is just not there in this naive approach to truth and transparency. So one of the possible issues may be, and this again is well known to the classical thinkers, when you are technically competent in one area, for sure, you risk overstepping and believing that your domain-specific technical competency qualifies you to speak with great authority and intelligence about everything under the sun. And the classics, mocked that to some extent by showing that, sometimes you could mock it, ruthlessly, sometimes you could mock it delicately, but by showing that people who possess a certain sort of technical know-how, still, when it comes to politics, they talk as though they know, but they don't. And when Socrates reveals the fact that they don't know what they're talking about, they get angry. Their young followers are affected. It's like people showing that somebody you admire is blowing smoke, doesn't really know what he's on about. So these are all the kinds of concerns that are at play, I would say. When you're not only when you're technically competent, but I would say as well with the new AI and cryptocurrencies and cryptography and all of this, there's not just technical competency. There's also the feeling that you're on the cusp of something unprecedented, completely new, epochal, and not trivial, not a matter of the 10th degree of importance. Like if you're an expert in LLM and robotics and you think that this is going to be a change that humanity has never experienced before, and that's going to change the equation for everybody forever, that's not the same as just being a good plumber, or like knowing how to fix a camera. So I think there's something that goes together with the technical competence, which gives you a kind of, a sense of being like a god on earth.
Yeah,
And
grandiosity.
yeah, exactly, that grandiosity. In some cases, what Sam Altman, he's going to be like the first one man company worth $1 trillion or something like that. I'm sure it's not that exactly, but that kind of thing could go to your head, I assume, and make you believe that you're an expert about more things than you actually are.
Yeah, and there's a kind of depth and contemplation when dealing with people, or certainly when dealing with political systems, that is interestingly much less required when dealing with machines, when dealing with purely technical things, but also in dealing with kind of high trust, high incentive environments, right? When you have people, uh, you know, San Francisco is the best example. People gathered together who are all very ambitious, but are all very, you can say, transparent or naive or honest. In some ways that's a virtue. In many ways that's a virtue, and you get this environment where you can make your way up to being worth billions of dollars and having a real impact in the world without that kind of knowledge about human nature or about social systems that you would need to if you're, say, going to be a politician or going to be any kind of elite in ancient times, at least by my reading. Would you agree with that?
Um, maybe I have to think here because on one hand, I imagine that somebody like Musk, let's say, who's managing large teams, big companies, and he is managing them apparently effectively. They seem to be accomplishing things pretty quickly. The most telling quote that I saw in the last couple of weeks, probably on this point, was Jensen from NVIDIA, who said, Musk accomplished in 19 days. I think the quote was what normally should have taken 4 years in setting up, 19,000 NVIDIA servers or something like that. So if to be able to do things that are very large scale, efficiently, quickly, and well, they work, and all of that. That's probably a skill that would be useful to have in government. So we're going to see if Trump wins and Musk does get to run the Department of Government Efficiency, or whatever they end up calling it. Which, why wouldn't they call it that? It'll be nice to see whether the principles of corporate management transfer into government in the same sort of way, and can he do in 19 days what would normally take 4, if not 40 years, and can he do it in a way that saves money and that works 10 times better than the existing systems do? Then we'll have some way of seeing even more clearly than we see now to what extent these are transferable skills from the domain of a company primarily involved with the development of new technologies, manufacturing, and all the rest of it to the government domain. So that'll be interesting to see. I do want to give credit, to credit where it's due, and be open to the possibility, and not just suggest that people, only people with, only Straussians with PhDs in political science are allowed to have any claim to knowledge about political systems. So that's one thing to be looking out for. And another thing is, I assume it has to be true that people like, again, people like Musk, people like Thiel, maybe people like Sam Altman, again, I don't know him as well, they must have some understanding of human types, again, to be a manager, to do all of that sort of thing well at scale, to get results from people, and always to be dealing with hostility and government agencies who are trying to sue you, and people who hate you and are laughing at you, and not to care, not to be affected by it in all of these different ways. So let's grant that they have some knowledge of human types, and they have some knowledge of management and organization and governing in a way, ruling in a way, because they have to govern their companies and rule their companies and all of that. Still, the classical question to my mind is there something that is distinct sui generis about politics, such that your technical expertise does not qualify you to know those things about politics unless you've studied the nature of politics as such. Okay, here too, take Musk as an example. He's recommended reading Homer. So at a minimum, we know he's read Homer, and you could learn something about human nature and about regulation of political affairs through that. I don't see them championing what I would like to see, which is Musk saying, I just finished reading Plato's Laws for the fifth time, or I just finished reading Plato's Complete Works and all of that, because I feel like Plato's a greater authority here for understanding the nature of political things than Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or whatever else some of these people may be reading or rereading. But that's the kind of challenge. I mean, there's things that need to be combined, and it's a rare case that you have somebody who could combine them all. What I love about this phenomenon of the tech right, what really encourages me, makes me very excited for the future about the prospect of a Trump win. And frankly, obviously, fingers crossed, I think it goes without saying, to me, it goes without saying that it's extremely important for Trump to win this time around. But let's imagine that he doesn't. Still, the team is not magically going to disappear. The people who have been brought together will stay together, I think, to some extent to plan for the future. But what's brilliant about this movement is that it combines people who have the tech expertise, which is an important part of the picture, the experience in leading large projects to successful outcomes that you can see, so not just some sort of speculative concept of a plan, but hey, look, we actually launched the rocket, caught it on the first try. So they have the technical expertise, they have the experience in putting wins up on the board actually that people can see. They have demonstrated proof of efficiency, and they have in their circles and around their circles people who are discussing Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Strauss, Nietzsche, okay, as well as other figures, Yarvin, and others. Whether we consider Bannon, who in his own way is bookish, or Thiel, who in his own way is bookish. The beautiful thing about this movement at the moment, to my mind, is that it is combining and collecting and connecting these various these various skill sets and advantages and aligning them. Great alignment of mutual interest here, where you don't just have the bookish people who have no operational skills. You don't just have the operators who have no clue about who Machiavelli was or why Aristotle's important. You have them together. And that, I think, is exciting.
Yes, incredibly exciting to me as well. What's interesting is that there is, as you say, a kind of intellectualism around Elon and around, certainly I see this with a lot of Silicon Valley figures, especially younger Silicon Valley figures, reading deeper into philosophy, deeper into political theory. You mentioned Yarvin, very popular among the youngsters. And what's really curious is that leads them to a very different place than traditional academia or the scholars of the last let's say 20 years for sure, but I would argue much longer, where there's this great post by Tanner Greer. I'm not sure if you've heard of him,
No, I
about
haven't.
the purpose of books in Silicon Valley versus DC. And he says, DC, the goal is to be the king of a very small hill,
All
right?
right. Yes.
You want to be the expert in, this specific subsection of the tax code, whatever. Whereas in Silicon Valley, you want to be a conqueror. You want to be someone who has seen many worlds, and that is the role of intellectualism in Silicon Valley. Uh, I think that's maybe a little bit oversimplified, but I think certainly Tanner writes in that direction. And the question I want to ask related to that is that, I think we both value kind of reflection and looking for deeper meanings. Of course, Strauss, famously wants you to look for esoteric meanings, secret messages in writings. Do you think that's the kind of Silicon Valley intellectual culture is compatible with the kind of reflection you ultimately need?
So I'm going to say a couple of things. First, about that distinction. I do remember reading that. and the distinction between the books that are being read in Washington, the books that are being read in Silicon Valley. And one way of looking at it is that Washington is for the establishment, and there are certain sorts of books that you have to read when you are within an established order. And so, Strauss writes about this with respect to medieval Jewish and Islamic thought, for instance. You have those legal scholars of the law, so legal scholars of the Sharia or legal scholars of the Torah, who need to know to very minute detail in some domain specific question, what is the law? So they become, generally speaking, let's say in the case of Jewish scholars, there's a tendency to read broadly, nevertheless, okay, to study the whole law. But this example is that when the law is already established, when the order is already established, you become expert in the minutia within the established order. But the Silicon Valley types, I think they're much more closer to the innovators, not to those who are operating within an established order, but those people who are looking to constitute a new order. So they're closer to the founder type. We use the word founder when you talk about Silicon Valley company founders, but as you know, the history of political thought, the founder is a figure, the figure who establishes the fundamental political or legal order at the outset. And one of the phenomena that people have observed is this kind of kinship of the Silicon Valley founder type, or the, if not kinship, then at least, sympathy of the Silicon Valley founder type towards certain forms of mysticism, let's say, or religiosity or spiritualism that are akin to the founders in the history of political philosophy being close to the gods or receiving their law from a god or something like that. Because somehow when you are not within the established system, but yourself on the cusp of establishing a system, not only are you in this innovative founder mode, you're in the realm of transcendence because you've transcended any established order. And therefore you're close to gods and spirits, muses, angels, and the whole realm of the mystical / religious / spiritual. So I think part of that is reflected too in this division of books and division of, sort of the division of labor between the establishers and the establishment, the new establishment. That's another thing. A lot of these founder types right now, they're building a parallel system. Yes, in some cases, they're taking over systems like Musk buying Twitter. But in other cases, they're showing how you can operate outside of established systems. And there too, there's something that brings them closer to all of the figures in the broader history of thought and action that are like that, a little bit transgressive, liminal, sometimes marginal, like that. And you can see that, I think, autist and so on. So I think that's part of it. And I don't remember now what you asked me the original question, because I wanted to comment on this division in the reading habits of the insiders and the outsiders.
Yeah, so I think you did kind of answer the question, which is what are the limitations of such a style, right? You can expand on that if you want. The limitations both kind of philosophically in understanding human nature or in understanding, the nature of the republic, or in terms of what they can accomplish in the world. In either case,
right? Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure. I do consider it an asset when you have smart people reading good books, and when they're reading them not just because they were written in the last 10 months or 10 years, but in some cases, they're reading them with the advice that you shouldn't read anything published after, 1920 or 1870 or wherever they draw the line. So take, for example, Mark Andreessen. He's constantly championing the serious study of old books, which is good. And Thiel already mentioned, Straussian moment speaks for itself, as do many of Thiel's interviews, if anybody needed to hear them. About J.D. Vance, you can just look at the articles about the people that he's surrounded himself with intellectually. And again, you're a stone's throw from Curtis Yarvin to Aristotle, whom he mentions, to Carl Schmitt, Schmitt's thoughts on legality and legitimacy. And so it's very important to have some exposure, some serious exposure, the more the better, I think, to these thoughtful accounts of human and political life. That can't hurt, I would say. Maybe if a person misinterprets them and gets overzealous and enthusiastic about them, really missed the message and somehow took it and ran in the wrong direction. I'm not sure that that's kind of a risk that we should be willing to take versus the opposite risk of people who have never read, never thought, never considered, and have no exposure to these books. All things being equal, it's probably better to run the risk that they get misinterpreted than it is to run the risk that they never get read in the first place. The Strauss side of the picture is an important one, but I don't really know broadly who the figures are on the tech right who are well versed in Strauss's understanding of the history of political philosophy, the nature of modern political science, and somehow the perils and the promise of political statesmanship and all the rest of it. Thiel is the most conspicuous of them for me because of his essay on the
Oh,
Straussian
sure.
moment. And I don't really know, but I would say that there's an opportunity for people in the tech right. Let's say Burnham is pretty big. Burnham's book, The Machiavellians. Burnham's got other books too, but a lot of people, I think Yarvin has recommended Burnham and Andreessen has recommended Burnham on the Machiavellians. And if a person was attracted to the idea that Machiavelli is important for politics, then they're really, within arm's reach of turning to Strauss's thoughts on Machiavelli, for instance, which could take them deeper than they ever planned to go, maybe deeper than they ever wished to go. So Strauss is always within striking distance for any of these thoughtful readers. Again, someone could be interested in Yarvin. Yarvin mentions Aristotle. Next thing you could be picking up Strauss to read about Aristotle's place in all of this. For example, in The City and Man, where you have chapters on Plato, Aristotle, and Thucydides. So yeah, that's there. But I would say one important caveat to all of this is that we have several interrelated questions, like what are the political prospects for these thinkers on the tech right? Can they move their operations from private or even public companies into government agencies and be equally effective? All of those types of questions. But then, there's the distinctly important Straussian concern, which is the quest for potential philosophers, which is related to the problem of political power, but is also, can be treated independently of it and somehow stands above it in dignity and importance. So the tech right can be a kind of, it can be a place where there may be potential philosophers identified and found who, whether or not they end up having some influence on politics, can at least become educated in a genuine sense that has a positive effect both personally and more broadly politically, and so on. So people shouldn't forget, whatever they may think about Strauss or think they know about Strauss, his ultimate concern was with the education of potential philosophers. It wasn't with brainwashing or propagandizing the next generation of political leaders. That's a related that happens somehow together with the primary concern of finding and educating potential philosophers, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that I do think that there's something quite subversive about the effect of Silicon Valley as a place, as a culture, as a people, on the ability to do philosophy, because you're just encountering a very different human type. You're encountering a type of person who, especially in the software world, has probably moved there from somewhere across the world, abandoned their old life to pursue a kind of greatness, either a kind of personal career in terms of just writing lots of software, or founding a company, this kind of megalothymia that drives a lot of, I think, Silicon Valley founders, this kind of desire for something greater. And I think that in many ways what you see coming out of Silicon Valley political thought is quite reflective of those people, but risks being misapplied. One common example of this that is often brought up here in DC is that Elon just wouldn't be able to do what he wants to do with the U.S. government in the same way that he did with Twitter because of restrictions on hiring and firing. Right, you just can't. Even if you have Schedule F, that still only increases the number of political appointees from, say, I think somewhere around 1,000 to somewhere around 10,000. Right, it's a lot, but it's not. It's still not a significant fraction of the U.S. government. So that kind of, you know, reduction may not even be possible. And there's a broader phenomenon that I think that's an example of, which is that the norms and the traditions, and I do think there are real traditions of Silicon Valley as a place, um, might guide political thinkers who are too rooted in Silicon Valley to misunderstand human nature as a whole.
Yeah, I think that is that's I think that's right. Okay, back before Russia invaded Ukraine, the great example of this for me was when Lex Friedman, whom personally I have nothing against. I think he's got a nice show, many good guests, and so on. But he had said that the next war will be fought like entirely in digital domains or something like that, and that was absurd to my mind on the face of it, because you can sort of see how someone whose primary interests are with cyber warfare and cybersecurity and new digital technologies could possibly think that. But but shortly thereafter, right, you had actually tanks going across territories in the good old fashioned way. Now, it may be that X amount of years from now, things gradually move in the direction where cyber warfare takes on a greater significance than it has had in the past. But to me, it was a sign of overly exaggerating your specific perspective on things. And as a result, being extremely laughably, although in some sense tragically as well, wrong. So you can see that being a temptation in Silicon Valley. The nice thing for me is that there's a good example of this as far back as Aristotle's Politics. Again, I learned this primarily from Strauss's commentary on the Politics. I wouldn't have probably made the connection the same way without it. But Aristotle discusses somebody who was an expert in, basically like a Silicon Valley type who's expert in one area, and then he applied his expertise to politics without understanding what's distinct and unique about politics, and it was a disaster. So that that temptation to take what you know and to run with it into domains where it doesn't really fit, that's an old one, and I think that's what you're describing. But take Elon and the US government for a minute. Number one, people said that Elon couldn't come into Twitter and fire 75% of the workforce and make any sort of improvements, and that it would stop working and all these sorts of things. That was all wrong. So people make predictions about what Elon can and can't do that turn out wrong. They make these predictions about him all the time, and he seems to prove his detractors wrong time and time again. So we may have here a thing where, despite whatever systemic obstacles are in place, you do also have a highly motivated and effective operator who pushes through and can show more than people are used to seeing what can be done within the existing confines, number one, and who also appears willing to change the rules of the game if there's no reason to keep them what they are. So these are open questions too. After all, there are things that a government with a mandate can do to, how could you put it, change the rules of the game into its favor and to make what it wants to do. Right?
That can be made.
Exactly. There can always be states of emergency. There can always be executive power can go a long way. Okay, it can break down many obstacles before it has to stop and stop before those obstacles. So these are all things. The track record that Elon has against people who say it can't be done. The question, which, by the way, is one of those questions that for Strauss and Thiel, belongs to, you could say, the mysteries of state or the secrets of state that not necessarily should be openly broadcast and publicized far and wide, which is just how far executive power can go in the face of legal restraints. And these sorts of things, they leave open the prospect that someone like Elon or someone from Silicon Valley could move into government and be an effective operator there, all of these other considerations notwithstanding. I think that's important and not unlikely, it seems to me. But with full credit to your point, it is nevertheless true that government is not the same thing, and that learning how government agencies operate and what government life is. Then again, Musk is not coming in there all by himself. He's going to have people in and around his circle who are well versed in the ins and outs of government. And he himself, if I'm not mistaken, has now been, sued so many times or had to go through so many different interactions with regulatory agencies. I think he said before they put the SpaceX rocket up, they had to see, like, was it going to affect the whales? Was it going to affect the crabs? Was it going to affect the dolphins? Was it going to affect the otters? They had to go through like all of these environmental regulatory loopholes that, for all we know, he may know much more about government than we think he does, having had so many interactions with it in that sort of kind of hostile spirit.
Right. That's a great point as well. And he's, a very prominent government contractor at this point with Starlink, with SpaceX as well.
Yeah, so we can't discount. He has clearly some knowledge of what government is and how it operates and how to make things work. So I wouldn't, I find myself, just, it's not me giving any sort of broadly generalizable, abstract insight here, but just for myself, I have found it like I got to check myself from time to time about the excitement of Elon being in government. So I'm not like a lifelong Elon fanboy or anything like that. I just see somebody who is, who seems to be putting results on the board, who seems to be pretty focused on what he wants to accomplish, whose accomplishments have some scope and significance to them. Again, even if they're, maybe he's wrong about something, maybe there's more important things than making human life multiplanetary or whatever the case is. But clearly he's got ambition, he's got vision, he has competence, he can get things done. Like I said, this setting up the server farm in 19 days instead of 4 years. And I get excited about it because what you're used to seeing in government is the opposite of all of that. It was supposed to take 4 years. It took 8 years. It was supposed to cost 10 million. It cost 100 million. It was supposed to work like this. It worked, half as well, twice as long, 3 times as expensive, never got built. You know what I mean? Like, everybody is used to seeing here in Canada, where I live, in the US, which is, I think the whole world will benefit from a US transformation. I know Canada will, and it's just going to excite and inspire a lot of people. So I have to catch myself from time to time. I can see going to the cynical extent and saying, oh, okay, Musk is in it for his own interests, or there's not a parallelism between working in government and working at, you can't just go in and fire everybody like you did at Twitter, sort of the black-pilled and cynical interpretation of what could happen. But actually, I think what's inspiring about the moment, what's exciting about the moment, and again, not to make it like a cult of personality of Elon Musk, I only know what any ordinary layman knows watching his accomplishments and his speeches and all the rest of it. But it's the idea that you're going to finally have a government, if Trump wins, God willing, that seems like it's willing to embrace actually competence, innovation, success, the things that are new and exciting, not just because they're new and exciting, but because they improve life for people. We've gotten used to expecting things to stay the same or get worse, I think. And it's refreshing and it's exciting to have the prospect on the table of things turning around. I should say that El Salvador, another case, which I don't want to claim any sort of special expertise in this area, but El Salvador showed that it's possible for a country to turn around. I don't think you have many, many, many cases in the world where you look at a place and you can sort of say, and even more importantly, somehow feel that it's moving in the right direction. I feel like broadly the zeitgeist is not that. Okay, but in El Salvador, it was clearly the case that they took something that was extremely bad, murder capital of the world. They turned it around in a way that was palpable, in a way that actually made families feel safe. When I was in El Salvador, I was invited there to give a talk on education, talked about Plato's Laws. Curtis Yarvin was there giving a speech as well. When I was there were many people saying they're moving back. He's like, oh, our families moved away when it got to be too violent and when it looked like the country was completely falling apart. Now that it's getting better, people are moving back. All of that is so amazing to see, to experience, to hear people talk about it, to feel it in the air. Also, Bukele's clear embrace of innovators, of entrepreneurs, of weirdos, okay, of eccentrics, but of people who are going to put something new and exciting into the air. I felt that there, and I can see the parallelism with the current team in and around Trump in a good way. And so Musk is sort of, for me, he crystallizes all of that. And just because of how much Democrats don't like him and seem to be hostile towards him and his companies, it just makes it all the more stark. So does it mean that it's going to be, a platonically perfect philosopher kingship? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that it's going to be a reorientation towards virtue in the sense of, let's say, the contemplation of eternal truths and things like that? No, not at all. It's going to be probably the spirit of American pragmatism, which is the truth is what works, and you have innovation, dynamism, invention, discovery, creativity, and excitement for the whole world. It's not going to be German idealism, but it looks like it could happen. And fingers crossed it does. So all of the kind of concerns and qualifications about how Silicon Valley types might misinterpret the world, that's true. That's there. That should be acknowledged and registered. But it should also be weighed against the question, do we want people in and around government who have a record of getting things done that work, that are good? And remember, not everybody in Silicon Valley does this. Not everybody in Silicon Valley does it well. And not all the people who do it well are in Silicon Valley. So you've got all of these distinctions. But still, by and large, I think the basic point is clear. People who are building things that work and who are making them work better and who can figure out ways of distributing them and scaling them and making them useful to people. That's in line with the great spirit of American pragmatism that, even has its own sort of mysticism. And maybe that's what we're seeing. Maybe what we're seeing with the Trump ticket.
Yeah, I do think there's this great tendency, even greater in Silicon Valley, but maybe across the entire world now, to think that everything is maximalist. It's either the worst thing ever or it's the best thing ever. As you say, an eschatological or an epochal view where, either Trump is going to be the Messiah or he's going to be the Antichrist, or, it's so hard to get somewhere in between, even though I think that most people, upon reflection, would conclude that the truth is somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that goes to either of these poles.
Yeah, Brian. One quick other thing I want to say, just on this topic of
Yes, feel free.
Silicon Valley and the technologies and these two different tendencies. Somehow, on one hand, the entrepreneurial tendency of these entrepreneurs and inventors, and on the other hand, somehow the more bookish tendency of the Straussian history of political philosophy. So here's what I want to just share kind of anecdotally, which is that I myself come out of a bookish tradition. Okay, I was pretty sure I was going to be an academic. Ever since I set foot in a university, I really loved just studying, writing, teaching. And so I went up through my academic career till my PhD. And as some people may not know, I won't get into details, but I ended up not following my PhD with academic employment, not because I did badly, but because I had an interest in a controversial Russian thinker named Alexander Dugin. And that interest got me effectively blacklisted from academia. But the upside of that was that I started teaching independently online. And so I built Millerman School, my private tutoring, my online video courses, and all of that. And one of the things that I noticed very early, which was completely new to me, it was unexpected, it was unplanned, I wasn't looking for it, it just happened. And that's that the first people who came to study with me privately or in my video courses, asking me, let's talk about Strauss, let's talk about Heidegger, let's talk about Plato, Nietzsche, Dugin in some cases, they were overwhelmingly like software engineer types, Silicon Valley types, entrepreneur types, founder types. And that was, as I say, that was surprising to me because I didn't know that. It's just something that I observed. And so what I saw was that people who are doing, building these companies or exploring these new and novel technologies, whether it's, again, large language models or whether it's new cryptographic technologies, they, not all of them clearly, but a sizable portion of them have some hunger for reference points in the canonical history of philosophy and political philosophy, whether that's Hegel or Kant or Deleuze or Aristotle or anybody else. And so that was amazing to me. That showed that they are looking for ways of interpreting and understanding their activity in this new context. I think that's very important. And as I reflected on the relationship between academic, bookish interest in all of these topics, and somehow entrepreneurial, market-oriented, business-oriented, Silicon Valley style interest in these questions, I found myself moving, sort of like conceiving of this middle ground where you have bookish philosophers moving closer towards tech operators moving closer towards bookish philosophers, and each of them finding a sweet spot in the middle. I think that's very important. I think it's a very intriguing phenomenon. I'll say it so for me personally. And it wasn't just exposure to people in Silicon Valley, entrepreneurial types. It's also that when you go out on your own, I didn't have a university paying all of my bills. I didn't have a university bringing me students. I had to build. I myself had to build. I had to make and market and do all of that. And so I myself became entrepreneurial. And I found that this middle ground sweet spot, and again, that's what I see in and around the Trump team, people like JD Vance, Thiel, they all represent this sort of middle ground phenomenon of people who either moved from the world of books, one step closer to the world of the operators, or they moved from, being pure operators one step closer to the world of the books. And they're occupying this very interesting intermediary domain. And I would say, how could you put it, suggestion, or let's just call it an observation for now, is, speaking for myself, it was the benefit of taking a step in that direction. And I sometimes look back to the people who are still bookish academics, and this includes people, they're not necessarily even in academia. Some of them graduated with their PhDs, some of them now just complain about the universities. Not all of them. Some of them are building great things, but the ones who are, they have a kind of, I don't know if you describe it as a chip on their shoulder, or they look down somehow. They look down on the non-purely bookish types. And I think that's a mistake. I want to say one word about that very quickly, because one way that this mistake can play out is like this. It's by looking at take large language models, or AI broadly speaking, and saying, aha, you've got Sam Altman, you've got these other figures. They think there's some sort of new philosopher gods. They're working with these new technologies, but we should deflate that. There's nothing new there. There's nothing serious. You could always learn more, from Aristotle than you can learn from these new technologies. In other words, they instantly and automatically and categorically denigrate the developments and discoveries of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial types. Then you have some cases where it's almost like, thinkers who show you how badly this can be done. Jordan Peterson, I don't have a problem with Jordan Peterson broadly. There are some people who do, I don't. But he, not too long ago, a couple months ago, he put out some piece of writing or something like that about, what we can learn about the concept of God using large language models. I reviewed that on my YouTube channel. I thought it was extremely poor. It was low level, okay? Like, it was extremely, extremely low level. But it doesn't mean, to my mind, that these new technologies, like large language models, or like, the combination of these models with robotics systems, well-developed, autonomous robotic systems, like with Optimus, those are extremely interesting developments. They may teach us something unprecedented. They do require our attention and our understanding. And there are places, I think Cosmos Institute is one of them, that is trying to be, acknowledging the cutting edge developments of all of these sectors at the same time as they're using, Aristotle to try to understand them. So I do think that's a valuable approach. And it's just more fun too, I think. So the risk, in some sense, if you go to the middle and then you become bad at the extremes, that's no good. You don't want to be like mediocre with respect to tech and mediocre with respect to the books, and you just found yourself in this mediocre middle ground where you don't know as much as the tech people do and you don't know as much as the philosophy people do. But still, somehow that middle ground is a sweet spot. It is important to get there. I think there's a lot to learn by being there. I myself, as I say, just observed it when people who were coming to me to study with me happened to be from Silicon Valley. That was totally, totally unexpected. I'm like, okay, they want to study being a time. Oh, great. What do you do? I'm a software engineer. I'm a founder. I'm a VC in some case. People came to me from crypto. Yeah. So it's like, that's noteworthy. It doesn't go without saying that somebody who's developing Bitcoin technology has an equally, and for them somehow even maybe essentially related, interest in Heidegger's fundamental ontology. That does not go without saying. That's fascinating. That's an interesting phenomenon to my mind. So that's just what I wanted to point out, that I think it would be a mistake for the purists on the philosophical side to be overly dismissive of what's actually pretty unique and incredible about these new technologies. And it would be, a mistake for the purists on the technology side to believe that there's nothing they can learn from a book written 2,500 years ago. Somehow going to the middle while preserving the great insights of either extreme is just, for me at least, it's the richer and the funner position to take.
Yeah, it's much more fun, I think, to at least have visibility into both circles, than it was for me in either in either case. I want to reflect briefly on something you said there, that there can be kind of philosophical significance or um, or spiritual significance to developments in technology. I think that's true. I think that's reflective even of uh, a lot of religious texts and religious traditions currently. I think something like the Sabbath points towards that importance. Um, but I also think that I agree with you in that the current kind of um, the current kind of eschatology or philosophy around AI um, seems almost like a cruel imitation. It seems like something that is, you know, um, I wouldn't say bad on purpose, but kind of close to that. Where I put it recently in an article. This will probably run before the podcast comes out. That the first people who thought about AI, um, they could not imagine a philosophy of anything other than it is better to rule in hell than to reign than to serve in heaven, um, and that has kind of cursed this entire subfield, this entire discourse um, for the next 20 years, and may do so for even longer. It is quite
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can't help the fact that there are going to be all kinds of different approaches to any new or even any old phenomenon. But, we have to just stop and ask ourselves, what do we find interesting about this? And including the fact that you just mentioned, one of the things that's interesting about it is how it has been interpreted by its leading developers and leading champions. But then all the questions that arise from that, I think the debates in and around AI safety, AI doomerism, the nature of AI, some of the questions seem misguided, but they all give us something to think about. And I would say that that's what that's what we have to do, is just try to so look, you've got the moral, the ethical, but to my mind the ontological debates are the more interesting ones. Why people in and around these new technologies might want to study the old books is because, like it's written in that Sovereign Individual book, it said even today's most advanced technological elites are morally, in effect, how could you put this without being overly insulting? They are, they're completely developmentally challenged when it comes to moral issues. They have made no progress beyond Plato and the Bible. So that's fine. That just means read Plato and the Bible, and then you have some way to think more carefully, potentially, about the moral and ethical implications of these systems. Maybe just read Plato. Nothing against the Bible, but Plato's enough too. So Plato and the Bible, and the Sovereign Individual and Confucius, I think, were mentioned as the sources beyond which we have made no progress, despite the great progress that we've made on other fronts. So that's fine. But, even let's say people who interact, and look, I think it's important to allow scope for a kind of naive curiosity and even naive wonder that can lead to deeper philosophical reflection. So let's say that somebody has interacted with a chat bot. Okay, they've gone on Chat GPT, they've asked it a question, they've gotten a lifelike response, and now they have this, this new experience that they may find naively like, a childlike fascination about it. Like, what is going on here? This is pretty incredible. I'm interacting with something. It's kind of lifelike or human-like in some way. Okay, in what way exactly? Well, just in the realm of communication. How responsive to you is it? How well can it understand you? How much is it or is it not like talking to a human being? And all the rest of it, all of those things can become questions. But just to allow that initial, as I say, simple curiosity to unfold into a set of questions and reflections, that should be permitted. Nobody should feel sort of ashamed, like, oh, these are just whatever. These are just, this is just matrix algebra. Like, why should I care? Or, oh, whatever. If you have the experience, philosophy somehow begins, can begin, let's say, in many ways. But one of the ways it begins is something strikes us as fascinating or interesting or surprising or unsettling or new or whatever. And to my mind, at least, these large language models, it's pretty incredible that you can, it doesn't really solve the mystery when you just say that they're next word prediction devices, or, it doesn't even solve the mystery to say that they've been trained on whatever they've been trained on. It's still somehow incredible that you can relate to them in the way that you can. And reflections on language, on the meaning of language, that's all part and parcel of philosophy since its inception. And so why wouldn't something like a large language model be exciting and give you, I mean, if a person completely doesn't care, nobody has a gun to their head telling them they have to care. But the point is, if you experience any of this as intriguing, then it should be fully permitted for whatever set of questions come to mind to get expressed and unfolded, and all the rest of it, up to and including all the moral conundrums that arise. When should the people responsible for these systems program them to lie to you, to conceal to you? Should they? What sort of ethical principles should they reflect? All of that's interesting. How could they be? How is it going to be different when they're embodied in and embedded in robotic systems? That's to my mind, those are interesting questions. So Plato, Aristotle, they may help us. Nietzsche, Machiavelli, they may help us. All of these great authors, they may help us. And the more we know them, the better. There may be works of literature, by the way, science fiction, that I myself don't really read. But, people have told me about novels like Snow Crash, and, maybe there are movies and other things that jog people's imagination, help them to express their questions and concerns, their aspirations and their desires. And all of that's exciting. So we're dealing with some new phenomena here. People in the mystical tradition have dreamt of language machines like this, Raymond Lull and so on. And now you have them, and they seem to work, and it's pretty amazing. Gives us some insight into something. What exactly is anybody's guess? Does it give us insight into the relationship between mathematics and language? What exactly does it give us insight into? Like I told you, Peterson had that video. Do large language models teach us something about the concept of God? Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. What exactly do they teach us? So what excites me as somebody who loves to learn and who loves to think and who loves to be around people who are thinking is that this gives us occasion for all of that. Not to mention the political dimension, which is, again, are the different large language models each like its own little regime or princedom or kingship? And does that mean that we can sort of apply regime analysis to the different kinds of large language model? Is there going to be a large language model end of history where there's only one sort of model that can win? Then there's even the economics of it. Like, one of the people that I tutor privately, he's let's put it this way. I tutor, as I mentioned before, VCs, investors, and other people like that. And in some cases, by thinking through the nature of these systems, we come up with economic theses too, like regardless of whether, to state it in the terms of the Sovereign Individual book, regardless of whether it's cryptocurrency, which is decentralized, so cryptographic technologies, which are decentralized, or AI, which is centralized. If those are the two new big technologies, and there's sort of a Cold War about which one of them is going to inherit the Earth, well, in either case, you're going to need energy because they're both energy intensive. So suddenly there's an investment thesis, which has been borne out recently with all these nuclear power plants going back online and nuclear stocks on a tear. So it's just all of these elements are thought provoking and interesting, and thank God for that. I mean, that's the way I see it.
Yeah. Something you mentioned there that I picked up on, Plato in the Bible. Strauss has a formulation that it's, at least difficult, if not impossible, to pursue reason and revelation at the same time. First of all, do you agree with that formulation?
Well, in the way that Strauss developed it, I do, but I guess a couple of things I have to say here. So, in the way that Strauss developed the distinction, which is really that, revelation has to do with obedience to an authority that goes unquestioned, not ultimately unquestioned. It's not like, I mean, within the Bible, you have instances of Abraham arguing with God, okay? And you obviously, within the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and the whole tradition of Western theology, have, many examples of people questioning what is the nature of God, what is the meaning of God, what is God, who's God, what is creation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as though the operation of questioning completely shuts down in the face of the authority of revelation. But for Strauss, it is the case that the bare fact of revelation, it puts certain strictures on what can be asked and how it can be asked, and sort of guides the direction of the questioning in a way that is not true of the philosopher. The philosopher should not have that sort of source of authority guiding his questioning. A divinely revealed source of authority may guide the philosopher's public speech. He may have to be deferential out of a sense of justice and reverence and piety to the revealed religion. But as a philosopher, in his capacity as a philosopher, when he is philosophizing, if he's just doing it, in his heart on his bed in silence, or if he stops on a walk like Socrates does and just thinks for a while, in principle, he should be beholden to nothing other than whatever has commanded the authority of his thought, which is going to be different from the public revelation, which often serves in Strauss's analysis a political role. It's very important for Strauss when he talked about revelation, the connection of revelation with law, and therefore with concerns of public order and public morality, and the distinction between law on one hand, with those interests and concerns that it has, and philosophy, which is somehow trans-political, trans-legal, and as he put it, for better or worse, trans-moral. So yes, I think the distinction in Strauss holds, but I will say that there's one way in which the problem recurs, and I have to put it like this just to be brief about it. So in some way, the most important philosopher of our time for Strauss, even though maybe he's the one that Strauss wrote and spoke the least about, he wasn't totally silent on him, but he didn't speak about him very often, is Heidegger. So Heidegger is extremely important to Strauss for many, many, many reasons. And the more I read Heidegger, the more I discuss Heidegger with my students, the more I think about Heidegger, the more I write about Heidegger, and the more I understand of Heidegger, the more I see a different way of interpreting reason and revelation that brings them closer, let's say. But if in Strauss, revelation does kind of culminate primarily in its political significance as a revealed code of law, that's less true of Heidegger, and maybe that's why it's easier to bring revelation and reason, or philosophy and mysticism, or different formulations of these two phenomena. It's easier to bring them together in Heidegger, maybe because of the conspicuous absence in Heidegger of a concern with law, public morality, and public order. So I think even though I think Strauss's formulation is correct, and even though there's a lot that we can learn from it, I also think it's worth sort of triangulating between Strauss and Heidegger at a minimum to try to get different approaches and access points to this question.
Yes, this leads very naturally into the next question. What's the role of mysticism and or revelation in Heidegger?
Well,
Yeah, we maybe don't have enough time, but
let me see if
let's
I
at
can
least
say
get
something
started.
brief about it.
Yes.
So, revelation. So it's kind of, how can I put this? It's not straightforward. Let's start with revelation and then turn to mysticism. Okay, so for Heidegger, the most important thing is questioning into that which is most question worthy. What Heidegger finds most question worthy, there are different formulations of this, but they all concern the fundamental ground of our existence, the truth of being. Now, it's impossible at first pass, especially for people who are not already well versed in Heidegger, to explain exactly what that means, because all of these words are extremely somehow technical jargon for Heidegger. Truth doesn't mean exactly what you think it would mean. Being doesn't mean exactly what you think it would mean. The truth of being doesn't mean exactly what you think it would mean, and so on. But we can say Heidegger's whole orientation is towards, the fundamental ground of our existence, and questioning is the mechanism that moves us deeper and deeper into that realm. And so as we question, we bring to light something that was concealed. And in some cases, we bring to light concealment itself. Now, this is weird, but people have to try to, there's no way around it. The things that are weird in Heidegger, you have to stick with until they become relatively clear. So there's bringing to light, which means bringing something out of concealment into the openness, into visibility. But another sort of operation is seeing for yourself that something is and must remain concealed. So in other words, it's possible to bring concealment to light while keeping it concealment. You're not undressing it. You're not making it naked. You're not laying it bare, but you're still somehow bringing it forward in its concealment. So this is an extremely important operation for Heidegger. And so this bringing to light, it has some sort of like revelatory aspect to it. And this keeping something in concealment, becoming aware of or attuned to, or being able to intuit or to perceive, okay, again, many possible different formulations here. That particular part of his thought, it is structurally similar in many cases to mysticism, because mystics have often spoken about, for example, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, I've often spoken about a darkness that exceeds the light. So let's imagine a very simple schematism here, a very simple like map of illumination. Take Plato's cave. Okay, start with Plato's cave. What's our ordinary state of affairs? Again, skipping the full details of interpretation here. Ordinary state of affairs, we see things, but we don't really see them as they are. We don't really see them truly. We see a manipulated reality, a shadow reality, a kind of like second or third degree reality. It's not totally unrelated, because after all, they're the shadows of things that are casting the shadows. So it's somehow related to something, but it's not the real deal. We live a shadow reality. But we can turn our souls around. We can expose ourselves to more and more of that reality, of true reality, of what really is. And doing so, we have more and more light. We move from the light of the fire up to the light of the moon, the light of the stars, and ultimately the light of the sun, so that, you have a kind of ladder of light. We go from darkness, shadows, and subterranean existence to the liberation that comes from illumination and enlightenment. So it's a story of greater light, which is one sort of mystical ascent. But there's also the beautiful passage in the allegory of the cave that the sun is not just the greatest being, not just the most beingful being. In other words, not just the brightest of all the lights, but it is beyond being. It's somehow like one step above light. And in the language of mystics of yore, that has always been described as, again, the darkness that is greater than the light. So that when you've exhausted illumination or enlightenment, there's like one more step that takes you into the secret that lies at the heart of illumination, but that is not itself illuminated. And that figure, which is, as I say, kind of a commonplace in some sense in mystical literature, is reflected in Heidegger's writing with his emphasis on concealment. And there are other parallelisms that can be drawn and other sorts of things that make Heidegger akin, in particular books like Contributions to Philosophy of the Event and these quote unquote middle period writings of Heidegger, that make Heidegger's writing in some sense more akin to mysticism than philosophy, although that's also not strictly speaking correct, because Heidegger, in presenting his thoughts, which can be, as I said, structurally mystical, he's fully within the realm of the language of philosophy. So he's writing about truth, he's writing about being, he's writing about Kant and Hegel, Aristotle, and Plato. And somehow his philosophy just goes so deep and it goes so far into that which he considers most question worthy, the truth of being, or in some sense the mystery of being, that it becomes mystical without ceasing to be philosophical. So Heidegger is to my mind almost unique in that. But again, the deeper question for me too is, Well, is he able to combine mysticism and philosophy in the way that he does, only at the expense of leaving out the centrality of political philosophy, which is for Strauss the heart of Strauss's project? And the opposite version of that, does the fact that Strauss's philosophy never becomes mystical in quite this way reflect for him the concern with the importance of the realm of the political? So it's kind of tricky to map all of that out, but for Heidegger, all thinking, if it's genuine thinking, if it's genuinely thoughtful, if it's actually true philosophizing, it's not just somehow rote repetition of metaphysical dogma, then it is somehow essentially revelatory. And in that sense, it's a kind of revelation, although it's not a revelation of a code of law. And because it's essentially transformative, and because it's oriented towards this concealment that never somehow makes itself unconcealed, but can present, it's oriented towards this darkness that exceeds all light, and in that sense is structurally mystical. So it's very beautiful, and I highly recommend, if anybody listening to this has read Heidegger but no Strauss, read Strauss. If you've read Strauss but no Heidegger, read Heidegger. If you've read them both, go read some mysticism, and you'll see why, in my opinion, these things triangulate so beautifully. They don't resolve the contradictions, don't resolve themselves, but you just get more and more insight into the fundamental problems.
For sure. I've been inspired to read more Heidegger. I've been kind of working up to the primary sources, but not quite there. Maybe over the winter break. But that's another great piece of inspiration. And I absolutely agree. A thing that I encounter more and more often when discussing political theory or political philosophy with um, either scholars, with operators, with technologists, is that there does appear to be a kind of black hole around certain ideas. Most recently, I think there's a black hole around the idea of good faith and around the idea of deception. There is a reality of deception, right? Or at least of self contradiction, where you can play clips famously, as done by John Stewart, play clips of people of statesmen saying one thing at one time and the exact opposite at another time. But there's another question of kind of orientation towards quote unquote good faith that does appear to be a black hole, does not appear to be something that is permeable by either reason or kind of evidence in the John Stewart sense. And it's not the only one of these questions. I bring it up only to mention that it's something that seems to be a recurring pattern, a recurring pattern that would not have been nearly as obvious to me when I was working in technology, and something that is very
Hmm.
important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that may very well be. I take your word for it, and I would just add, that it's helpful to try to find those black holes or those areas that aren't being covered, and then hopefully we find either we ourselves can contribute to saying something about them, to helping to fill in the blanks, or we find people who address those issues and help us to connect the dots. But I'm sure you're right. That's one, and maybe not the only one.
Yes, many such cases. Um, I want to cover, with the time that we have left, um, Nietzsche, Nietzsche and Strauss, and I think that there was this book that I learned about from you actually, Lawrence Lampert's Plato, Nietzsche, and Strauss, um, and what really fascinates me as a Leonid is that I think that there's this concept of the world historical. This is one of my critiques of Silicon Valley philosophy, if you can call it that, um, which has gone on for many years now, which is that there is an overemphasis or perhaps a desire to fit everything into a world historic formulation. And that removes the personal stakes. It removes what I see as a very Christian element of caring about the individual, of caring about the personal and the familial and the particular in a relationship or in an act or in a drama or in a story. Everything has to be pushed towards the world historical. Everything has to be about the thing that changes the world the most, the thing that the thing that shifts the course of empires, shifts the course of humanity, so on.
Hmm.
And what I really took away from this is that this feels like quite the idea that they're even separable feels like a very modern phenomenon. I'm not sure if you would agree.
I'd have to think about it a little bit. Let me see. Does the separation of the world historical from like the personal or the individual? Um,
One counter
well,
argument might be um, Gerard kind of makes the case that it's sort of the opposite, that Christianity united the two, united the world historical and the personal and the individual. Although, yeah, maybe I just disagree with Gerard here.
hmm. So I will say, I think you're right that there's an orientation towards, or there can be in some of these thinkers. In Heidegger, I would say it's true. There's more of a concern with the new era that we are entering, this other beginning of philosophy. Again, these are, I mean, books like In Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, where you don't really have a concern with the personal or the familial. You have a concern only with the question: does the thinker make a breakthrough to the realm of the most thought worthy? And if he does so, and if he can steadfastly sustain the revelation, as it were, of truth that he receives in that realm, then he is inaugurating another beginning of philosophy and sort of setting out a fire that has to be preserved by the few and the rare future ones. Okay, these are Heideggerian formulations, all of them: the few and the rare, the future ones, steadfastness, grounding the truth of being. That's sort of his model. So in Nietzsche too, at times, not to say it's true, across the board here for Nietzsche, but Zarathustra has to do in some sense with whether a new teaching will find its adequate disciples in the future, since there are no adequate disciples for this new teaching in the present. So there is a lot here
Yes.
of questioning towards the new shape of the world and what's it going to be and who's going to help to bring it about. It's not going to be just everybody. It's not going to be Joe Schmo and his neighbor. It's going to be, in all cases here, the few, the rare, the exalted, the chosen, the special ones, the puppy dogs of the philosophical race. In some sense, is Strauss's version of this formulation. These natures, these few select chosen natures that can help to inaugurate a new era. And I think you're right that stands in contrast. For example, I know this better from the Jewish tradition than from the Christian tradition. And what I'm referring to is this emphasis on, look, maybe there will be a new era. Maybe there will be a messianic era or something like that. But our primary concern is not with being the ones who inaugurate the new messianic era. Our primary is concerned with, are you being a good parent? Are you being a good son? Are you being a good father? Are you being a good family member? Are you taking care of what you have to take care of in the way that you have to take care of it? Like, it's very much about the small network of family ties and community ties and local. It's about your life at a smaller level. It's not primarily world historical. Now, it's true that in, let's say, the Jewish tradition, both biblically and more broadly, let's say by that I mean like Zionist thinkers, they do sometimes see political events as being significant in a world historical sort of way, like the reconstitution of the state of Israel after an exile and diaspora of many centuries. That ends up taking on a certain sort of significance that transcends just the boundaries of the individual personality. For sure, it starts to be part of the great drama of the Jewish people, and in that sense, quote unquote, world historical. But generally speaking, there's this emphasis on just like, are you educating your children well? Are you taking care of what you're supposed to take care of here and now in a decent sort of way, minus the grandiose aspirations of statecraft and worldcraft, So there may be something to that. I'm sure, and I would imagine, and I have some examples coming to mind. For you, it's Gerard. For me, there are some Russian Christians who wrote about the relationship between individuality, personality, nationality, and and world spirituality, so to speak, or world historical providence. So, but I don't have a simple, I don't have a simple statement or formulation about any of that. I will just agree with you that there are some tendencies, probably more so within like the innovator slash founder ways of thinking and circles, that are really focused at unprecedented world changing events, and less so perhaps on just, underlying ordinary everyday humanity.
Yeah. What I think that there's an important relationship between the two where you're absolutely right that you see this in Strauss. And I'm persuaded now, actually, after reading this, that you see this in Nietzsche as well. Maybe it's pretty obvious if you read just Zarathustra that there's this kind of passing of the torch, right? The idea that if you can't find the few who understand, who really awe you and extend your thought that you write for someone far into the future, and that the more talent is drawn into the world historical, into kind of changing the world now. You can kind of see this as a tension between Marx and Strauss, or Marx and Nietzsche even. Um, the more people are drawn into changing the world in the moment, the less this torch is likely to be picked up.
Mm-hmm. Um, well, yeah, I mean, one thing behind the scenes of this issue is, it's the debate over whether and to what extent history matters at all. It's clearly a debate that includes the problem of revelation, because, for people who believe that, let's say, the Christian revelation was a uniquely significant historical event, well, clearly, history begins to matter when revelation is on the table, in a way that it may not matter before revelation is on the table. So Strauss, he never really accepts a formulation like world historical, because for Strauss, thinking takes place not within a history, but within a cosmos, or that the unchanging eternal order is greater than the changing temporal order. So the very status of history, is at stake when we raise the question whether something is world historical or not, whether we should use or not use that category. World historical is opposed in some sense to like the world in a world historical sense is opposed in some notion to the cosmos, as the unchanging order within which all of these things take place. Another way of formulating that, which I think is true-ish to the facts, okay, I would want to say it's 100%, but it's close enough that we can sort of ignore the qualification. So you said there's Marx and Strauss on one hand, and there's Marx and Nietzsche on the other hand, but there's also, Marx and Nietzsche versus Strauss in one sense, which is that both Marx and Nietzsche have this openness towards the future, towards the question of the future, whether it's logical, rational, whatever it is, but that the future is going to be maybe significantly different. Again, we add in all the question marks that belong to Nietzsche here with the eternal return of the same. What status does history have under the thesis of the eternal return? That's an important Straussian and not Straussian question too. But still, Marx and Nietzsche on one side and Strauss on the other, because Strauss is more adamant than Nietzsche and Marx are that thinking takes place within an eternal order that is not itself historical in the fundamental sense. Whereas I think Strauss, when he writes about Nietzsche, again here, leaving open the possibility that this is not 100% the full story, there's more to say, but still, that in Nietzsche sort of has his cake and eats it too, in the sense that on one hand, you have the importance of history, so therefore of the future, therefore of the Superman, therefore of the disciples to come, therefore of the new teaching, all of this, you have a future orientation. But at the same
And you have
time,
the internal recurrence.
exactly, which serves as his version of renaturalizing the whole, or recosmosizing the whole. But Strauss doesn't need to recosmosize in some sense. Strauss doesn't need a subterfuge to come back in and secure the naturalness of the order, whereas Nietzsche does need that. Strauss can just, have reference to the naturalness of the order, or at least to its, to that possibility or to that problem. So these are sort of these are subtle distinctions between these thinkers, but for relatively rough approximations, they are useful. So Strauss, would not really openly embrace the formulation of world historical. He would call all of that into question, including, its Hegelian, let's say the initial, the notion of the world historical in Hegel. Strauss has problems with all of these things, and I would say prefers the Platonic formulations, which can do just fine without the idea of a world historical, unprecedented event.
Yeah, and I think that there's the kind of Silicon Valley mysticism or Silicon Valley religious revival is deeply connected to this. I think it is deeply connected to, at least in that zone, right? At least in Silicon Valley itself, an overemphasis on the world historical.
Yeah,
Um,
I just want to add here on this point, I heard Thiel, this was probably sometime in the last 6 months or so. He gave, this is a video interview of his that I heard. I don't remember where he was speaking, but he was asked something like whether I'll just paraphrase it. Like, what's more important to Thiel, the constants of human history or the variables, so to speak? Like, not everything is unprecedented. So, Thiel, what do you think is more important? Like the cyclical similarities of recurrent structures or the sort of unprecedented novel events? And this is interesting given, Thiel's familiarity with Strauss, who I'd say is uh, more focused on the unchanging underlying patterns than he is on what's ultimately unprecedented. Strauss is more focused on the constancy of human nature, the constancy of the fundamental problems of political order, the constancy that we can discover when we read carefully books that were written 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and today if they're written intelligently. But what Thiel said was that he thinks there's a risk that focusing on the cyclical and the structural and the constant will have us underestimate what's actually unprecedented about the contemporary or about the new or about the current. And I thought that was pretty interesting. That's actually not what I would have guessed, actually, to tell you the truth, before I heard him say that. But he seemed to be quite cautious with respect to, you could say, the approach that puts us towards the things that don't change. And he really wanted to have a correct analysis under every new set of circumstances of what is new and uh, you know unaccounted for about the present situation. I think he used nuclear weapons as one of his examples, and I imagine he's adding to that list of examples all the time. But even there too, you see, like, those are two possible ways that you could look at the world. Like, it would be a mistake to believe that we can't learn anything from the old expositions of those things in human nature that are constant. I mean, like, what could we learn from Aristotle or Plato? They wrote thousands of years ago. You could learn a ton from Plato and Aristotle, despite the fact they wrote thousands of years ago, apparently because they're addressing something that's relatively stable and unchanging. So that much is clear. But there's also, that other risk. What happens if we don't take due account of what is new, or what is, like, less well known, if not completely unprecedented? And then maybe people who have an orientation towards this novel, towards the new and unprecedented, maybe that's correct, but it's possible that an exaggerated form of that leads you to thinking only in terms of, like, world historical events and world historical movements and world historical significance of things, and suddenly you leave the other part of the picture uh, out of your account. I don't know, but Thiel's an example, and what he said, I think, is significant, and it just forces us to think about how to place, how to balance out those two imperatives to get the new on its own terms and in the right proportion without losing track of the constancy of our nature.
yeah, how I read Teal is that his, um, I wouldn't know if I would call it his foremost philosophical principle or his foremost moral principle, but definitely one of them is promotion of greater agency, right? So in saying, you know, oh, it's all cyclical, it's all, there's no kind of divergent moments. That's in some ways a minimization of agency, and I think he also tells this. He also has this aphorism that's something like, if everyone thinks that we are going to muddle through our problems, then he's very concerned. But if no one thinks that we're going to muddle through our problems, he would be less concerned. I think that's in the same vein.
Mm. Hmm.
What's interesting to me is that, yeah, in many ways, the philosophy in Silicon Valley diverges heavily in from the practice when it comes to this. When it comes to the thing we started this conversation off with, kind of either trying to determine precisely an outcome or just accepting what happens, right? I think the Ivan Illich formulation is hope versus expectation. And that seems like a barrier that um, even very well read technologists either do not want to or are just disposed against giving a more kind of accepting, a more hope rather than expectation way of framing the world.
Hmm. So I don't really know that distinction that well in that author. For me, it actually connects more with Heideggerian's sort of way of being towards the future. But maybe you could just say a word about that distinction and how you see it playing out.
I think it's fairly intuitive that with some decisions, take personal safety for example, there's much more of a desire to ensure that nothing bad could ever happen, and of course that's always going to be an incomplete project. But you would hope that going through most of your life, you've planned it or someone has planned it in a way that you won't be randomly shot, you won't be randomly killed. Whereas there are other things in life, philosophical achievement, art, some would say startups, where you can't control for everything. You can't even control for half of it. And you're really drawn to it because you hope for something greater. It's not guaranteed. It's not, it's far from certain, but you have that hope. Now, what's really interesting in the context of Silicon Valley is that I think that when they go into their projects, right, when they go into actually doing work, starting their company, it is a very hopeful act. But when they go into philosophy, when they try to understand the world, when they try to reason about the world, they want that heavily determined. Um, they want that kind of denouement. They want that kind of certainty much more so than they do in their kind of ordinary lives. Well, maybe not so ordinary, but in
Hmm.
their day to
Hmm.
day.
Yeah, that's interesting. That may be if you've seen that or observed that the expectation that systems of thought or that schools of thought or books or authors or ideas or something is going to provide them with a solid ground instead of being able to sort of withstand the elusive, mysterious, or uncertain. Or Strauss always used this notion that philosophy is not primarily in the business of giving us answers. It's a quest based on the fact that we realize we're missing something extremely important, and it's the quest that sustains us and that gives us meaning and that proves to be the best and happiest way of life. Not because necessarily it has satisfied us by giving us the answer, and also without shutting down the possibility that it can answer. So Strauss, he didn't say philosophy can never answer important questions, but you should pursue it anyways. But somehow it's the quest itself, and if the quest is there for you, then you have to recognize the fact that there's still openness, there's still uncertainty, there's still something undecided and unresolved, uh, that you continue to pursue. You pursue as the thing that's most important and that you see you're missing and that you need the most. But it's not, you know, I think it's another way in which Strauss distinguished between somehow public philosophy and private philosophy, or between philosophical edification and genuine philosophical pursuit, which is that there's some message that you can give people that gives them hope and that somehow answers their questions well enough to let them live if that's what they need to live. But at the same time, there's this other more private side of philosophy that isn't satisfied even with those comforting answers, whatever they may be. Maybe they are about the eternity of the soul, or about the afterlife, or about the just get rewarded and the unjust get punished, or whatever else it may be. There's a certain kind of to refer back to that Lawrence Lampert book on Strauss, Plato, and Nietzsche. There's a certain kind of philosophic poetry that's designed to give comfort and succor and and direction to people who need it, but it's distinct from philosophy proper, which I guess, as Hegel said and Strauss repeated, must beware the wish to be edifying. And just, the starker version of it, Heidegger called philosophy an all-consuming fire. So you may not necessarily find comfort in that, but some people are compelled to pursue it nonetheless.
Maybe it's good to take a step back here and look again at the relationship between epistemology, political philosophy, and and mysticism. This might be a good way to prod at this. I think the results of politics, the kind of regime that we live in, is something that concerns us both. At the same time, I think we both have our eye on something greater, something that transcends that, something that's longer term. What kind of role, if any, do you think the political order plays in that?
So it plays a role. It can set out the commonly shared views and opinions that set the terms of debate for many people. In the United States, debates in and around the Constitution, around constitutional principles, obviously have been very important for thinking through certain topics like freedom of speech and freedom of association and so on. So that's a way in which the political order, the constituted political order, has shaped in some sense the direction of the questioning. And there are other ways, sometimes an overly oppressive or tyrannical political circumstance, it can put a chill on thinking together with other intelligent people and chase thought underground and, make thought revolutionary or whatever the case is there. Strauss showed that it can affect how people write, for sure, but it can also affect, how people think and what they think, whether they think as well. You could probably scare, not everybody in some sense is born to think. So there are atmospheres that are freer, that allow for, open inquiry, and then atmospheres that are less free, that suppress it and maybe snuff it out altogether. So those are all things, those are all cases where what's happening, and then wars, different kinds of political events that happen domestically. All of these things get people to think about basic principles or basic, how could you put it? Things that they find more important or less important. Like how should we resolve the problem of, on one hand, wanting to liberate people to pursue their talents, and on the other hand, dealing with the inequality that arises because of, inequality of talent, ambition, access to resources, and so on. Okay, so sometimes a political order is going to really put that kind of question under the magnifying glass just because of the way that things are playing out. Or, criminal justice. I believe Trump has mentioned that he wants to do mass deportations, because of the number of illegal immigrants who are in the United States at the moment. So, okay, all kinds of questions that arise around that, about the status of an act of illegal immigration, and are you justified or not justified to do deportations? How do you even begin to think clearly about that kind of problem, about the responsibilities owed and the duties owed and all the rest of it? So there are all kinds of topical situations in politics that I think give rise to, concomitant philosophical or theoretical reflections, maybe mostly moral and ethical, but not only. And so those two things are related. And it's not just, what's happening here and now. That sometimes people reflect on a longer history of political activity or of political life and change. And they say, well, like Kojève did in his debate with Strauss, for instance, in On Tyranny, people may have read, does the sequence of political regimes tell us something important about human nature and about God's involvement in world affairs, about the way that truth develops in time? And do we see something like, can we infer or discover a principle of progress just by looking back over the way that politics and regimes have changed in a sequence over time? So these are all potential ways. I do think that Strauss offers a useful corrective, or let's put it this way. Strauss, as indebted as he is to Socrates, to Socratic thinking, I think we can maybe give the credit, if not to Strauss, then directly to Socrates, which is there's a way of thinking that includes, reflection about the things that concern us as citizens: good government, competent government, justice, law, order, peace, prosperity, wanting to make sure that you're not enslaved by other stronger countries, wanting to make sure that you don't have, rampant criminality and all the rest of it. So the things that concern good, normal, decent, if not great and very desirable domestic order on one hand, and those broader trans-political questions that, sound very abstract to people who are mostly interested in politics, like, what is the nature of motion? What is time? Is there a soul? What's the relationship of multiplicity and unity? So a full-fledged life of philosophizing, I think, in the Socratic spirit includes both of those, and it sort of ascends from one to the other without ever leaving politics and a concern for the political behind. The philosopher shouldn't become insensitive to human affairs. He shouldn't become unfeeling towards human beings just because he's always thinking about other matters. So Socrates gives us, I think, for Strauss, and I would say, we should all consider the Socratic model a very compelling model of what it means to philosophize while nevertheless remaining, a good and just citizen who still is basically concerned with problems of political morality and political order.
Yeah, that's great words and a great place to end it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my episode with Michael Millerman. If you did, like I said at the beginning, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. You can also help us out by giving us a 5-star review, leaving a comment, and suggesting future guests. If you want access to exclusive articles, then you can also subscribe to a paid tier on the Substack. All of that will be linked below. And of course, if you want another great episode, then subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening for free, and I'll see you next Monday.